Welcome to tonight's rather tragic love story, Romeo and Juliet, starring our two charming actors, Marbles as Juliet, Pepper as Romeo. A cozy retelling of Shakespeare's timeless tale. Our story begins in the beautiful city of Verona, where two families share an ancient rivalry. Long ago, in the beautiful city of Verona, there lived two powerful families, the Montagues and the Capulets. Both families were wealthy, respected, and proud. Their homes stood high above the winding streets of the city, where lanterns glowed warmly in the evening and the sounds of music drifted through the air. But despite the beauty of Verona, peace was something the city rarely enjoyed, because for generations, the Montagues and Capulets had been bitter rivals. No one quite remembered how the feud began. Perhaps it started with a careless insult, or a misunderstanding that grew larger with every passing year. Whatever the reason, the hatred between the families had become part of everyday life. Servants argued in the streets, cousins challenged one another to fights, and the citizens of Verona had learned to step carefully whenever members of the two houses crossed paths. Even the Prince of Verona himself had grown tired of the constant quarrels. He had warned both families many times that their fighting must end. But pride can be a stubborn thing, and so the feud continued. Two great families living in the same beautiful city, yet divided by anger and ancient grudges. Little did they know that the very thing which might finally bring peace to Verona was quietly waiting just around the corner. Love. In the Montague household lived a young man named Romeo. Romeo was known throughout Verona for being thoughtful, romantic, and just a little dramatic. He enjoyed poetry, he admired the moon, and he often spoke about love as though it were the most powerful force in the universe. At the beginning of our story, Romeo believed himself to be deeply in love with a young woman named Rosalind. He wandered through gardens, sighing. He stared sadly at the night sky. He wrote poetry so emotional that his friends sometimes wondered if he might faint from the sheer intensity of his feelings. Unfortunately, Rosalind did not share Romeo's enthusiasm. In fact, she had made it quite clear that she had no interest in romance at all, which made Romeo's endless poetry somewhat ineffective. His cousin Benvolio tried to comfort him. "Romeo," he would say kindly, "the world is full of beautiful people." But Romeo simply shook his head. "No," he sighed dramatically, "there has never been anyone like Rosalind." Now, here is a rather amusing fact about Shakespeare's story. Romeo begins the play convinced he is hopelessly in love with Rosalind, but within a single evening he will completely forget about her and fall in love with someone else, which suggests that Romeo was not only romantic, he was also remarkably quick at changing his mind. And as fate would have it, that very night was about to change everything. That same evening, the Capulet family prepared to host a grand celebration. Their halls were filled with music. Lanterns glowed warmly against the stone walls. Guests from across Verona gathered to dance, laugh, and enjoy the night. Of course, members of the Montague family were certainly not invited. But Romeo's friends had a clever idea. "What if we simply attend the party anyway?" Benvolio suggested, "with masks." In those days, masquerade balls were quite fashionable. Guests often wore elaborate masks while dancing, which meant that it was surprisingly easy to hide one's identity. And so, with a mixture of curiosity and mischief, Romeo and his friends quietly approached the Capulet house. Music drifted out through the open windows. Laughter filled the courtyard. Inside, the ballroom sparkled with candlelight and celebration. Romeo hesitated for just a moment. Sneaking into the home of your family's greatest rivals is not usually considered the safest decision. But youth can be adventurous, and so the young Montague stepped into the Capulet celebration, hidden behind his mask, unaware that the next few moments would change his life forever. The ballroom was filled with music and movement. Guests danced gracefully across the polished floor. Silk gowns shimmered in the candlelight. Laughter and conversation echoed through the hall, and for a brief moment, Romeo forgot all about Rosalind. Then suddenly, he saw her. Across the ballroom stood a young woman named Juliet. She was the daughter of Lord Capulet, but Romeo did not know that yet. All he knew was that the moment he saw her, the world seemed to slow. The music faded, the dancers blurred into the background, and Juliet stood there, glowing softly in the warm candlelight. Romeo stared in amazement. "Did my heart love till now?" he whispered, "for I ne'er saw true beauty till this night." Which is Shakespeare's very poetic way of saying, wow. Now here is another fun little detail. In the original play, Romeo and Juliet meet, fall deeply in love, and secretly marry, all within the span of just a few days, which means their romance moves along at a rather impressive speed. But when two hearts recognize one another, time sometimes behaves in very unusual ways. And as Romeo stood there watching Juliet, it became clear that something extraordinary had just begun. Later that evening, Romeo discovered something surprising. Juliet was not simply another guest at the party. She was a Capulet, the daughter of the very family his own family despised. Most sensible people might have taken this as a warning. Romeo, however, was not particularly known for sensible decisions. Instead of returning home, he quietly slipped into the Capulet garden beneath Juliet's balcony. The night air was calm, the moon shone brightly above Verona, and Romeo waited quietly among the shadows. A moment later, a door opened above him. Juliet stepped onto the balcony. She did not know Romeo was standing below, but she gazed out into the night and sighed softly. "Oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" Which simply means, why must you be Romeo Montague? Why must the person she had just met belong to the one family she was forbidden to love? Below the balcony, Romeo listened in amazement, because Juliet felt exactly the same way he did. Two young hearts, two rival families, one impossible situation. And yet, neither of them wished to walk away. Romeo stepped forward from the shadows. Juliet gasped in surprise when she saw him standing below the balcony, but the two quickly began to speak, quietly, carefully, as though the entire world might shatter if they spoke too loudly. They talked about their families, about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together, and about the powerful feeling growing between them. Romeo promised that his love was true. Juliet admitted that her heart felt the same. In Shakespeare's play, their conversation becomes a beautiful exchange of poetry, each line flowing perfectly into the next, as though their thoughts were already connected. And in that quiet moment beneath the moon, the two young strangers became something more. Two hearts from rival families, now bound together by love. If this moment were happening in the world of cockatiels, this might be the point where Romeo offers Juliet a most valuable treasure. Not a diamond ring, not a golden necklace, but perhaps something far more impressive in the bird world, a perfect spray of millet. And Juliet, naturally, would accept, because millet, after all, is very romantic. And so, beneath the moonlit sky of Verona, Romeo and Juliet shared their first kiss, unaware that their love story, beautiful as it was, would soon become one of the most famous tragedies ever told. Beneath the quiet moonlit sky of Verona, Romeo and Juliet continued their secret conversation. The garden was still. The soft glow of lanterns flickered in the distance, and the gentle night air carried the scent of roses through the courtyard. Juliet leaned carefully over the balcony, her voice hushed but full of emotion. She knew the truth now. Romeo belonged to the Montague family, the sworn rivals of her own house. Yet, despite everything she had been taught, her heart had already chosen. Romeo felt the same. Standing below in the shadows of the garden, he promised Juliet that his love was true and unshakable. They spoke of fate, of family, and of the strange way the world sometimes places love in the most inconvenient places. In Shakespeare's play, this entire conversation is written in beautiful poetry, filled with promises and declarations that have become some of the most famous lines in literature. But beneath all the poetry, the truth was quite simple. Two young people had just met and already believed they could not live without one another. And so, under the quiet watch of the moon, they made a daring decision. They would marry, secretly. The following morning, Romeo sought the help of Friar Lawrence. The friar was a wise and thoughtful man who lived in a small chapel on the edge of Verona. He listened carefully as Romeo explained his sudden and passionate love for Juliet. At first, Friar Lawrence was surprised. Only the day before, Romeo had been heartbroken over Rosalind. Now he spoke as though Juliet had always been the only person in the world. But the friar saw something hopeful in the situation. If Romeo and Juliet truly loved one another, perhaps their marriage might finally bring peace between the Montagues and the Capulets. And so, in the quiet light of the chapel, the two young lovers were secretly married. No grand celebration, no musicians, no crowds of guests, just the soft glow of candlelight and the quiet blessing of the friar. It was a hopeful moment, a promise that love might succeed where anger had failed. But fate had other plans waiting just beyond the chapel doors. Later that day, trouble began to stir in the streets of Verona. Tybalt, Juliet's fiery and hot-tempered cousin, had not forgotten the insult of Romeo attending the Capulet party. He was furious. In Tybalt's mind, a Montague stepping into their celebration was an act that demanded revenge, and so he sought Romeo out. When Tybalt finally confronted him in the street, he challenged Romeo to a duel. But Romeo surprised everyone. Instead of drawing his sword, he refused to fight. Unknown to Tybalt, Romeo was now secretly married to Juliet, which meant that Tybalt had become Romeo's family as well. Romeo tried to speak calmly. He begged Tybalt to let the matter go, but Tybalt saw Romeo's refusal to fight as weakness, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Romeo's closest friend, Mercutio, could not tolerate Tybalt's insults. Mercutio was bold, witty, and fiercely loyal. Seeing Romeo refuse the challenge, Mercutio stepped forward to fight Tybalt himself. Swords flashed beneath the afternoon sun. Steel clashed against steel as the two men circled each other in the crowded street. Romeo desperately tried to stop the duel, but in the chaos of the fight, Mercutio was struck. As he fell, Mercutio cursed the endless feud between the families. "A plague on both your houses," he cried. His death changed everything. Romeo, filled with grief and rage, finally drew his sword. And in a swift and terrible moment, Tybalt was killed. The street fell silent. The feud had claimed another life, and Romeo's fate was now sealed. News of the violence quickly reached the Prince of Verona. The ruler of the city had warned both families many times that their fighting must end. Now another life had been lost. Standing before the prince, Romeo faced the consequences of his actions. Although Tybalt had begun the conflict, Romeo had taken revenge, and for that, the prince delivered his judgment. Romeo would not be executed, but he would be banished from Verona forever. If he were ever seen within the city again, his life would be forfeit. The sentence struck Romeo like a thunderbolt. To leave Verona meant leaving Juliet. To leave Juliet meant leaving the person he loved most in the world. And yet, the prince's command could not be ignored. Romeo would have to flee the city before nightfall. In her chamber, Juliet soon received the terrible news. Romeo had killed Tybalt, and the prince had banished him from Verona. Her mind struggled to understand the impossible situation. Romeo was now her husband, but Tybalt had been her cousin. She mourned the loss of her family, yet her heart remained loyal to Romeo. For a moment, grief and love seemed to battle within her. But in the end, Juliet's love for Romeo remained stronger. Even though he had been forced to leave Verona, even though danger now surrounded them both, she refused to give up hope. And so Juliet sat quietly in the soft glow of candlelight, gazing out into the moonlit night. Somewhere beyond the dark hills surrounding Verona, Romeo was already fleeing the city. Two hearts, newly married, already separated by fate, and the greatest tragedy of their story had only just begun. Juliet's world had begun to collapse around her. Romeo had been banished from Verona. Her cousin Tybalt was dead, and her parents, unaware of her secret marriage, had arranged for her to marry another man, a nobleman named Paris. Desperate and frightened, Juliet went to seek help from Friar Lawrence. Inside the quiet stone chapel, candlelight flickered against the walls as she explained her terrible situation. She told the friar that she would rather face death than marry someone she did not love. Friar Lawrence listened carefully. After a long moment of thought, he revealed a dangerous plan. From a small bottle, he produced a sleeping potion. If Juliet drank the potion, she would fall into a deep sleep that would make her appear dead. Her family would place her in the Capulet tomb, but after 42 hours, she would awaken. Romeo would be secretly informed of the plan and come to rescue her. Together, they could escape Verona and begin a new life. It was a risky plan, but for Juliet, it was the only hope she had. That night, Juliet returned to her chamber. The room was quiet. Moonlight poured gently through the window as candles flickered beside her bed. In her hands, she held the small glass bottle Friar Lawrence had given her. For a moment, doubt filled her mind. What if the potion failed? What if she truly died? Or worse, what if she awakened alone in the dark tomb? But Juliet thought of Romeo, of the promises they had made beneath the moonlit balcony, and slowly her fear gave way to courage. With steady hands, she raised the bottle. "Romeo," she whispered softly, "I drink to thee." And with that, Juliet drank the potion. Moments later, the powerful sleep took hold, and she collapsed gently onto the bed. The next morning, the Capulet household prepared for what they believed would be a joyful wedding day. Servants hurried through the halls. Music was being prepared. But when Juliet's nurse entered her room, the celebration suddenly turned to horror. Juliet lay motionless upon the bed, her skin pale, her breath silent. The household erupted into grief. Her parents wept beside her. Servants cried out in disbelief. The wedding day had become a funeral. In accordance with tradition, Juliet was carried to the ancient Capulet tomb and placed among her ancestors. No one realized that she was not truly dead, only sleeping, waiting to awaken, waiting for Romeo. But fate had already begun to interfere with Friar Lawrence's careful plan. Far away from Verona, Romeo waited anxiously for news. He expected a message from Friar Lawrence explaining how he and Juliet might be reunited, but the message never arrived. Instead, Romeo received terrible news from a traveler. Juliet was dead. Overcome with grief, Romeo could hardly believe what he had heard. The love of his life had been taken from him, and he had not even been there to say goodbye. In his despair, Romeo made a final decision. He would return to Verona. He would go to Juliet's tomb, and there, beside her, he would remain forever. Without hesitation, Romeo set off toward the city he had been forbidden to enter. Under the cover of night, Romeo arrived at the Capulet tomb. The moon hung high above the stone archways as he stepped inside. Candles flickered beside Juliet's resting place. She lay there peacefully, dressed in her beautiful gown, as though simply asleep. Romeo knelt beside her. He spoke softly, remembering the night they first met at the Capulet ball. Remembering the balcony, the secret wedding, all the moments that had passed so quickly. Believing Juliet to be truly gone, Romeo drank a vial of poison he had brought with him. And there, beside the person he loved most, Romeo took his final breath. Moments later, the potion began to wear off. Juliet slowly awakened, but the tragedy had already unfolded. The news of the tragedy spread quickly through Verona. The Montagues and the Capulets gathered at the tomb. For the first time in many years, the two families stood together in silence, looking upon the consequences of their hatred. The feud that had lasted generations had taken the lives of the very children they loved. Grief replaced anger, and slowly, the bitter rivalry between the families finally came to an end. To honor the memory of Romeo and Juliet, a monument was built in the city of Verona, a statue of the two lovers, forever embracing. Their story would be told for centuries, a reminder that love can be powerful, but that pride and hatred can be even more destructive. And so, the tragic story of Romeo and Juliet came to its end, but their love would live on forever. And so ends the tale of Romeo and Juliet, a love story written not only in poetry, but in the hearts of those who remember it.